We've had 2 extraordinary days hearing a wonderful range of material, eternal knowledge in every direction, absolutely wonderful. You've never been given any opportunity to ask any questions. You've probably forgotten what some of the talks were about, but this is your opportunity to bring up those kind of ideas. So we're looking to you right now.
Anybody want to ask any questions? Sorry, if you can just wait for the microphone to get to you.
The lady over there.
Does anybody know anything about Saturn worship?
Does anybody know about Saturn worship? Right, okay, I'm going to have to... It's gone...
Well, yeah, we can, it's not relating to what I was talking about, but do you know about anything about Gough? Gough? George Ivan... Yeah? Gough was a Russian mystic in the 20th century who wrote an extraordinary trilogy of books called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. And in those, he talks that the inhabitants of Saturn are the crows. And there was a whole... So your question was about Saturn and Saturn worship. Saturn worship, I don't know, but he said that they were the guardians of one order of wisdom which was brought to planet Earth via the crows. That's the only part I can say to remember. So that's by George Ivanovich Gough, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. It is the most incomprehensible book if you get going on it.
Right, okay, thanks.
I'm a bit concerned about this Saturn worship because Saturn is Chronos and Chronos is time, and the whole of our culture worships a thing called the deadline. Whereas I think we ought to be worshipping the lifeline. Next question, please. Sorry.
Yes, if I can follow up this worship of Chronos and time. In my little introductory talk, I talked about the fact that we're now in the Kali Yuga, and I gave you some fairly sort of mind-blowing years. But the Kali Yuga, you probably remember, is the shortest of all. Well, just as much life and experience is packed into that shortened Yuga as exists in all the others. So one of the real identifiers that we're deep already into the Kali Yuga is this obsession with time, that we all believe there just isn't enough time. So welcome to the Kali Yuga.
And I'm obsessed with time as well. I keep taking time away with my work.
Is the Kabbalah linked to any of the knowledge we've learnt about this weekend?
Right, is the Kabbalah related to any of the knowledge? Well, who's going to start on that?
Very much so. I mean, I spoke in my talk about some of the early 17th century Rosicrucians and Freemasons, and their view of the eternal knowledge or ancient wisdom was utterly grounded in the Kabbalah, sometimes more in a Christianized Kabbalah, sometimes more in a Judaic Kabbalah. But I think the combination of the wisdom from Kabbalah with the Hermetic texts was very much the way that the wisdom passed into our modern world. So I would say it's not just related, it was central to how it's come to us. It's changing, obviously. We have access to a wider range of information, but personally I think the Kabbalah is one of the most elegant and comprehensive expressions of the ancient wisdom.
It's just a personal note. I don't know much about words like Kabbalah or ancient wisdom. I just want to think, I think there is a kind of wisdom that is there out there, and it's the wisdom where time no exist. And we have like we have like lost the connection to that. And it's like a shaman. He don't learn like in books, this plant is good for that, or this plant is good for that, from generation to generation. No, the shaman would learn to his children how to get that information, but he would not learn that in books. And we have to learn how to get that information. That can be by intuition, by all those capabilities that we have to rediscover. But they are within us. All that know-how is there, and yeah, that was just a personal note I wanted to tell.
I never set out to study bees. I went to Spain to study with a Kabbalist who taught Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau, and we were going to study the Rennes-le-Chateau parchments. She was going to reveal the mysteries of those parchments via the Kabbalah, because she believed the mystery requires the knowledge of the Kabbalah to understand. And over breakfast, we had a bee like the size of my fist fly around the breakfast table, and we got to talking about bees, and we spent 3 years decomposing the history of bee veneration using the Kabbalah, and so that's kind of how I stumbled upon it, and a lot of the things I've discovered have been discovered in the process of looking at history using the Kabbalah as a context.
It might be worth adding, for those who don't know the derivation of the word Kabbalah, that it comes from the Hebrew root meaning to receive. And whilst that we can see that reception as meaning receiving texts from the past or receiving knowledge in a more dead way, it really means the receptivity you get from listening. And in the first instance, that's the oral tradition, listening to what a teacher or a guru passes on. But ultimately, the reception is what Whaymund started us with on the very first lecture, which is listening to the knowledge which is eternal and here and ever present, if we can just be quiet enough to hear it. So that is the concisest understanding of Kabbalah you could have. Just listen.
A question to ask of David Rohl. When you arrived, you seemed somewhat quizzical. Quizzical? Yeah, somewhat puzzled. Are you still puzzled? Has this weekend made any sense to you at all?
I'm more bewildered than puzzled, I think. No, I'm a bit out of my depth with this material.
I just want to know why.
I'm a very practical Egyptologist. I look at evidence, and evidence takes me wherever it takes me. And it's my religion, I don't believe in something, I have to see it for myself. And that's the sort of pursuit that I go with my archaeology and the evidence I look at. I do make comparisons between cultures and all those things, and I'm here to learn just like everybody else. And I've learnt an awful lot this weekend. And I've really enjoyed myself, apart from the ruddy weather. And the sun comes out just as I'm doing my talk, and nobody can see the slides. Yeah, exactly. I missed the key line I was going to say right at the end of the talk, which was that the age of Sep Tepi the first time was the age of the flood and destruction. And just as I started my lecture, out comes the sun and the age of Ra and the pyramids. So it was a bit of a fate, I think.
Any other questions?
The gentleman over there. Just wait till you get the mic, please.
Yeah. Oh, okay. How do you do? This is wonderful. An absolutely wonderful event. Totally amazing. But there's two things, that occur as basically natural effects: superconductance and levitating superconductors.
Sorry, you have to speak up a little
Oh,
bit.
superconductors and levitating. There's two natural things that fit, particularly with the beehive aspect, and then something that Harry Oldfield and I were talking about. It has to do with the blink rate. All matter blinks in and blinks out, and when it blinks out, it's in the gap, and in that gap is infinite potential, which you can tap into in however manner, which is the ultimate. There's not 5 dimensions, 2 dimensions. You go backwards. The honeycomb is 2 dimensions. The honeycomb is 2 dimensions. Okay, sorry. All right, so do you understand superconductance that works off the honeycomb, and also Grabinnikov's cavity structure effect, where you had a flying platform that came in harmony with the ethers? Because it came in harmony with the ethers, it was able to levitate and travel like 900 miles an hour, things like that.
Well, my answer is I probably don't. But there may be people here who do. When I think of the gap, I just think of Mind the Gap and the shop, a bit primitive. So superconductance and the space, the blink.
I know where Mike's coming from, and I've had some conversations with Mike to do with this blink rate, but I suppose the nearest I would get is where the vortex flows out through the point. I was talking about Schauberg and the vortex, and where it flows out through the point. If I was going to do anything, it would be there. If I was going to change something or have a look at something, be at that point. That's where I'd explore it, because I'd look for something tangible I could do with the idea. Anything that takes a step in that direction to understand it, but I know what he means. In a way, it makes a lot of sense. So there's something to do with
all the Schauberger stuff and all the Reich stuff work in that manner.
Yeah. So anyway, that's where I'd look. And there's another aspect to this which we call time. The one that changes my mind in relation to the way things happen. I mean, Gurdjieff talked about time of breath, time of waking and sleeping, and time of life. Or he didn't actually. It was probably Ouspensky. When Ouspensky asked Gurdjieff what is time, he said time is breath, which is a 4 seconds ratio, and there's also a ratio to 24 hours, and the time of life, which equals 70 years, extrapolated up infinitely and down infinitely. But the one that's stuck in my mind is time is of the essence, and that usually means hurry up, but to me it doesn't, because if there's any time in the essence, there is no time. It is a timeless place. So when I think about time is of the essence, there's all the time in the world, because it's to do with my frequency and vibration. It's not an external measure of my experiences over a given period. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, this is not, Mike, this is not directly related to your question, but it's kind of indirectly related to the question, because I work in the field of cymatics, which is basically the field of visible sound. And there's been a lot of talk about vortexes this weekend. And what I can tell you about vortexes from the cymatics point of view is that when you put a pure single frequency sound into the cymoscope device that I created, you always get some form of beautiful geometry created. Somebody actually wrote to me recently about bees and wondering whether the sound of the bee creates the hexagon shape and so on. Well, there's definitely truth in that. But coming on to the vortex itself, what I'm saying is a single frequency never ever creates a vortex. You have to have a second frequency that disturbs the purity of that pure single frequency. Put a pure frequency in and you get a beautiful, stable, geometric pattern, never a spiral, never a vortex. Put a second frequency in and you tip it over the edge, you tip the geometry over the edge, and suddenly the beautiful spiral appears. So I don't know whether that helps you in any sense, but
the two frequencies have to interact in the 1/3 integer area. It's the physics of it's very straightforward.
There you go. They have to interact.
There's the sine wave never actually crosses the x-axis, blinks in and blinks out. The scientists used to call it the 1/3 integer, or the physicists used to call it the half integer area, but in actuality it's a 1/3 integer area, and every orb on this solar system provides us with proof of that. The red spot in Jupiter is at 19.5 degrees by the north or south, whichever. And the sine of that is 1/3, so it's exactly 1/3 the distance, to the apex, And so basically that's where the sine wave blinks out is at 19.5 degrees, and it blinks back in at 19.5 degrees below, and so on and so forth. And so
it's a little technical stuff there. I just want to give again a personal note on that question and about anti-gravity. I think it's very interesting. We are Eternal Knowledge Festival, and I see also we are looking for answers for today problems in the kind of eternal knowledge or to improve life. An example, a car. We have to make roads for a car. We have to build roads in the nature. And then with the car we go over the plants, over the frogs, and we kill a lot of animals. That's not very harmonious with nature. And I think anti-gravity is a solution that exists. We see that in like vortexes. I think in the center of the vortex, it would be very interesting to do experiments about gravity and mass. And there are already experiments done, and it seems that the mass seems to lose mass, or maybe it's just a pulling effect or a different kind. And it's also in the eye of a cyclone. You see huge houses, they blow away high in the sky. It's like there's no mass, and it's just with the air. You see, and I think we have to invent technology that is in harmony with nature. It's just if we can invent a car that in place of driving on the ground, it just floats. We don't need any roads again. We don't need to make roads in nature, and we would not kill animals by driving. Technology, it's okay, but it has to be in harmony with nature. And we have now just to adapt our technology just in the right way, and we would live in a very wonderful world. And the technology is there. So we just have to think different. So we know the apple, the gravity, it falls down, and now we have to think different that the apple go again. That took 3 go, you see.
Thanks. Perhaps because I'm not a scientist, I like to cash out scientific concepts into things I can personally experience. But where I can relate to your question, thank you, is that you spoke about the infinite potentiality in the gaps, and that's something that it's very easy to experience in meditation. That as you develop the practice of meditation and you get used to the ground state, the nothingness, and in detachment from thoughts, you then experience states of relative consciousness arising. You have the sense that they're arising from the primal source and the power and creativity of the process by which that happens, and the infinite spaciousness as you go into that, the sense of time expanding to a most incredible degree. And I wonder, it's wonderful as these scientific technologies become available, but I think that to make the best use of them and to make sure that we use them in a way that's holistic rather than potentially destructive, we have to go through the same process within ourselves of discovering the place within us that infinite potential resides, and certainly meditation is one of the most direct ways to do that. So I hope that's helpful.
I'm just reminded of how much alchemy is so much about knowing yourself and working on a kind of inner knowledge as well as the outer knowledge of the apparatus. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? You want to ask a question, Lucy?
To keep the mic man on his feet.
Now, I wanted to ask Tim about DNA and solfeggio. Could you explain?
Yes. My musical work is certainly... Tim, wait for the mic.
I'm so sorry. Thank you. Imagining it was such a great sound all week, and I was thinking we were just sort of speaking into the ethers and it was amplifying, so beg your pardon. Yeah, my musical work, aside from obviously the creative process, I've become very interested in the aspect of frequencies and tuning in alignment with the body. And to answer very briefly your question, one of the branches of my research and thinking is what we call the ancient solfeggio. And it's utilizing derivatives of the number 3. So, for example, we have a frequency 528 hertz, which is the number of vibrations per second. And that apparently, as I'm understanding, and I'm researching more, and I'd be very happy to be illuminated by anybody that's more expert in this, but my understanding is that scientists repair human DNA with this frequency. And what this implies to me potentially is that, well, just to premise that by saying that sound, as you increase the velocity, has the capability of creating light. So the implication there, very simply, is that we are all beings, all 7 billion of us, beings of sound and light, because there is a correlation between the two. Do you have anything to add to that? Because I know it's...
Yeah, again, it's kind of indirect, but I wrote an article recently that's called "Sound Gives Birth to Light," and it's actually a really good article, even if I say so myself. But the point is that you cannot have light without sound. You just can't. The two things don't. You can't get light unless you have sound. What do I mean by that? Well, in the beginning of the universe, the very first thing that happened, if we believe in the Big Bang, obviously we've got to start somewhere. But if we believe that there was a primordial explosion or a primordial atom that eventually expanded, and into smithereens, into billions and trillions of particles, then light, which is electromagnetism, can only come from collisions between particles. You cannot have any light, you can't have electromagnetism until you have two particles that collide. So without the sound, which is the collision between particles, you can have no light. And the other point I'd just like to illuminate on a little bit there, that Tim was talking about, the DNA, that there has been work done in Hong Kong by some scientists that have used sound to create microvortexes. And the reason that they're creating these microvortexes is because they want to manipulate, listen to this, they want to manipulate DNA through these microvortices in order to, to manipulate genetic science and so on, to further genetic science. Now this is really quite ironic, because here you've got sound creating microvortexes that are creating an opportunity to manipulate DNA. And I have the belief that DNA was actually created in the first place by sound. Sound creates microvortices under the right conditions. And so I have that belief that sound created life. And so I think it's quite ironic that they're now using sound to create microvortices in order to manipulate DNA. Anyway, I just thought I'd add that in, Tim.
Can I ask a supplementary, which is, do you think that they use sound to do the original genetic modifications of domestic animals then?
No, I've never heard of that. I didn't know that they use sound in any sense. I know that sound has been used as a modality for both healing and harming, and but I've never heard that no, I haven't heard that sound has been used for deliberate genetic modification. They use other techniques. But this, what I'm talking about, just talked about there, about the Hong Kong scientists, in that case, they were looking for a means of manipulating these tiny little, I mean, they're so small that you need an electron microscope to see DNA at a cross-section. And they used sound to create the microvortices that manipulate the DNA.
Well, I don't want to dominate this Q&A, but it's the other aspects of Thoth in his name of Jehuti as to do with the original sound and the word, and whether that hold the Jed pillar, and whether that all has things to do with vibration, and whether we're kind of like reverse engineering, working out that they use sound to create shapes deliberately and create form deliberately, that these were not random events. I'd really be interested to know what any of the
one thing that I would add to that, or to answer that, is that I'm sure David Rohl would be able to jump in here. Is that the god Ptah? He was the guy who first said, at least as far as I'm aware. Anyway, David, you might know more, but he was the first guy that said in the Shubako stone that the word created the universe, basically, that the word was the spoken word brought the universe into existence. And what's amazing to me is that now that we know that sound was involved in the formation of the early universe, I mean, this is a fact, that sound actually created the way that galaxy clusters are here and galaxy clusters are there with equidistant spaces. The current cosmological theory is that was all created by sound in the very early universe, within the first million years of the first of the creation. So the fact that in ancient times the god Ptah, noted on the Shubako stone, actually said these things is, to me, amazing. How can ancient peoples have known that the sound was involved in creation of the universe? That is extraordinary to me. Would you like to add any to that?
Just to say, of course, that's the book of Genesis as well, isn't it? In the beginning, the Word. The Word is everything. And it's not just about the science of sound. It's the transmission of knowledge through word, which is so essential to civilization and to progress. And from that, you go from sound to writing. And before writing is prehistory. As soon as writing is invented, you get into history. And history is knowledge. You pass knowledge on from generation to generation through history and writing and sound and word. And without those two things, you don't have human existence. And human existence doesn't exist without those two things. God doesn't exist without a name. You have to have a word for God, otherwise God doesn't exist. You have to have a word for everything, otherwise it doesn't exist. So the word is the essential ingredient here, and the word is part of sound. And then you transfer that to the record through writing. And now we have devices to record the word without writing. Things are changing again. But essentially for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, it's been about the word being transmitted through script, and therefore knowledge passed on from generation to generation. And that's how we function as human beings, through those two devices.
Do you think that's why we're so far off target then?
Well, can I just have it back a second? The problem then is how you interpret word, and how you interpret things like the Old Testament or the Bible. This is a game we play, interpretation. History is not the past, what happened. Those are events, and the evidence of those events are archaeology and scripts, texts. And then we play this game we call history, which is interpretation of those facts. And if you read a history book from the 19th century, it's a totally different history book of the same subject to a modern history book, or one pre-Holocaust, for instance, post-Holocaust. So it's more, in a sense, history is more about the interpretation of the past as people see it in their own times, and how their modern times, their own times, influence the way they think about the past. And so you will see in a good Victorian library, or even a modern library, you'll see a set of shelves over here with the archaeology books, and you'll see a set of shelves over here with the history books. The ones on the left will be eternal. They will always be useful. The ones on the right you might as well put in the rubbish bin, because they'll change every 50 years.
I just want to make an observation, because it does say in Genesis, in the beginning was the Word. Well, actually, in the beginning there must have been the consciousness that created the Word. The Word only became called the Word as we know it when there was something to interpret it or listen to it. So I think there was vibration, and some of it condensed as matter as we know it. But if it was a certain consciousness that gave it the label, then there had to be reception for that vibration that we give the label to, called the Word, which is fairly obvious, which might be the ear. Leads back to does it make a sound if the tree falls on a desert island? Well, yes, it vibrates the air, but only if there's something there to interpret that sound and give it a label. So it's a two-way thing, and it's not often mentioned.
Lots of different words about the words. Yeah, just to point out, doesn't mention about the word in Genesis. That's in John's Gospel. In Genesis it says that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But yes, but John's Gospel ties together with the question about the DNA, because John's Gospel's, well, actually, and with what you just said. Firstly, it says that the Word was in the beginning and was with God, but also was God. So God was naming itself and creating and becoming aware of what it was doing in the same act. So there wasn't just the Word, there was the consciousness of the consciousness. But it then also goes on to say that there was life in the Word, and that life was light. So the sound, life, and light are all three parts of the same thing. In terms of names, Genesis describes Adam as giving names to the animals, and of course, in the ancient way of seeing things, a name, if you know the name, the true name of something, you are, as it were, its creator. You have power over it. I think this is going back to a primal idea that Adam, the original humans, were almost the creators or the shapers of the animals, that they put these sounds in. And in terms of reverse engineering, this is exactly what Kabbalah teaches, that our alphabets are, like with cymatics, they are primal signs that represent primal consciousness in the divine mind that can be expressed through sound, presents itself in form as shapes. So everything we see around us is a final result of a primal sound, and you can work back from what we have through the shapes to the archetypal shapes to the sound and the original life power. And that is exactly the aim. In fact, there are even two stages. It was seen that you ascend through reverse engineering to the one consciousness, and once you've attained that oneness, you can then redescend to create in a godlike fashion. So you hear of Jacob's ladder, in which divine beings ascend and descend. That's the Hermetic task. We ascend to the oneness, and then we descend in creation. I
have a question relating to that, and it feels important, so I want to talk slowly, because these are crucial core matters. And you were talking about reverse engineering, Lucy. Could it also be forward engineering in the way that you were saying there about the godlike quality? Because we can also name things. We can call this a yurt. If we don't call it a yurt, it ain't a yurt, yeah? And so so my question, as I don't know if I'm breaking the rules here, from here asking a question, is do we have godlike function now? Is that the forward part? Is that part of our job?
Would you like the floor to answer that?
I'm just looking upwards.
Could I ask a question if...
Yes.
Oh, yes. Neil wants to. Okay.
Yes, just wait for the
Neil,
wait for the mic, please.
I'm sorry, I can't remember who said it, but someone was talking about all the different interpretations of God that we've had over the eons. And that if there was only one God, we can't have discovered it. Otherwise, we'd all agree it was the same thing. So I suppose, Jane, the answer is yes, because we've all got to find that in us. If it is in all of us, I'm afraid that's where I've just got to stop. Yes.
I'd like to ask a question if I could. I'd like to kind of switch it onto the archaeology instead and ask the archaeologists about these civilizers that appear to have come into all these different civilizations and what more they can elucidate on who these characters were and maybe some previous civilizations, any information that they have on that kind of thing as well.
Well, actually taking from what David's talk just was, which I find logical and compelling, that the Egyptian rulers came from Sumeria, and Sumeria, as far as we know, is the oldest sophisticated civilization. And the fact that they're bearded, that is a tale that shows up definitely in Central and South America, where you have three characters. One is Viracocha, one is Kukulkan, and the other is Quetzalcoatl. But one thing a little correction is that it's not Viracocha. Viracocha is the creator god. It's the Viracochans who were sent by the creator god to educate. A major thing about oral traditions, from my experience, is that you never read them in a linear way, and that's where misinterpretation comes from. For example, the simple concept of Atlantis, where people say Atlantis sank beneath the waves. If you look in a linear way, you're saying a continent sank. Geologists have proven that is impossible. There is no continent that sank in the Atlantic. However, if you look at it as poetry, it could very well mean the waters rose because the land did disappear. So at the end of the Ice Age, you have ocean levels rising 350 feet vertically up. And so any great civilization that I know of in general tends to live by the sea. So all of those people and all of their structures are underwater. But in terms of these civilizing people who came, it seems like Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan and Viracochan, it wasn't necessarily a person, it was people. And the same symbolism always occurs, and that's the feathered serpent. That, again, you have to interpret. And in terms of the Inca were the pyramid of civilization, or the peak. They learned from everyone that came. That was their intelligence, was that they learned from everyone that came before them. They borrowed the symbolism, or inherited the symbolism, from everyone who came before them. So in the philosophy of the Inca, there are three levels of consciousness. The subconscious is represented by the serpent, because the serpent's on the ground, and everyone in general knows that a serpent is an ancient being. So that's the ancient wisdom. And then the conscious mind is the puma, because the puma is a mammal and walks around on the ground like they have 4 feet, we have 2, but they walk around, conscious and looking. And then the superconscious is the condor, because the condor flies in the air and is closest to the sun. People have misinterpreted again the Inca concept that they were worshippers of the sun. It's not the sun. The sun is a symbol of energy, of the source. It's the power behind the sun. Human beings need something physical to refer to. That's why the cross, is used for Jesus. It's a symbol. But whoever these people were, these Viracochans, they were bearded men. They were tall, and they were light-skinned. They were not white-skinned. And that, again, is a problem I come upon time after time, because native people don't want to hear that somebody possibly from Europe came, like that Jesus showed up. It's like, no. These were light-skinned people who taught, and then because of the, in some ways, ignorance of the people of the area, after a while they didn't want to hear what these people had to say. And so in the case of the Viracochans, they went to the coast and they disappeared. And Viracochan means the foam of the sea. So they left in the distant past in the Pacific and never came back. Thank you.
The civilizers coming to Crete, I think from yesterday's talk I can say that the DNA is showing up, that they came from areas that David has referenced, so from south central and central Anatolia, and the Kabul Triangle, which is something that David's talked about as well. So people, the Cretan, coming across from that region, coming into Crete. During the initial Neolithic around 7000 BC. Interestingly, Ian Hodder is currently, or during the past couple of years, has been investigating the DNA of people at Çatalhöyük to see where they're coming from. I haven't heard back from him, so I'm still waiting on that. But yeah, be interested.
Yeah. Go first. Yes.
this is a subject that's been of some interest to me for considerable time, and I think to just sort of bypass the kind of technologies that were shown in your talk of people who obviously at least one and probably two civilizations who predated the Inca, if you like. We haven't got any dates or any idea who those people were, and there's 3 sites that particularly have interested me in my researches, each of which takes us further back in time. One is Göbekli Tepe, which is indeed in Anatolia. There's been, as far as I know, 40 or 50 standing stone blocks excavated so far, and they're in broadly curvilinear structures. They're not necessarily circles. They appear to rise geometrically out of the ground. Some of them have got arms on them. They are between 3 feet and I think 13 or 14 feet tall. They have like little brick niches built between them, which is, you know, this place is supposedly now 10,000 years old, although I'm not sure how they've dated that, and I'm not sure whether that's the date of the burial of this place or the date of its manufacture. There are really intricate carvings on many of these stones, of many of them of creatures that we'd recognise. There's like a really good one of a boar, there's snakes, there's birds, there's lots of those strange little bags that you see in Egyptian and Mayan carvings as well. The thing is that a resonance search of the site has suggested that there's yet another 250 stones to be dug up, and this place is supposedly 8 or 10,000 years old. So that really blows all of our megalithic history as it's written out of the water. If that place is really that old, and also who buried it. As a landscaper, there's 3 whole hills in this place that cover this thing. You know, where'd you get that stuff from? And who did it? Somebody clearly wanted to hide that for whatever reason. It's a huge structure. There's computer-generated images of what it must look like. It looks like a series of circles acting like gears. Absolutely huge, and we have no idea who built it, or where they went, or why they built it, or who buried it, or anything. All we know is that it's there. If we go a little bit further back to Çatalhöyük, which I think was occupied for quite a long time, some 3,000 years, was it between 13,000 and 17,000 BC, something like that. The richest single find of Neolithic artifacts anywhere around the Mediterranean. Hundreds of dwellings, and they're all kind of they're made out of adobe. They've got kind of thin adobe walls, and access was gained to the houses through the roofs, and the place was of all sorts of varying heights, and it had open areas in it as well, which allowed certain amounts of light in. But the thing is, all of these places were on different levels, because what they used to do was every now and then they'd choose to pull down the roof, pull down the walls, compact everything into the ground of the living area, and then build a new residence on top of it. And this is still the way many mounds and things are constructed over in that neck of the woods. But we're talking up to 17,000 years ago, and there were lots. These dwellings were broadly similar in type. There's at least 14 layers of them, and I'm not entirely convinced that they've actually gone right down to the bottom of them. Some of them have got people buried. The only difference appears to be there's no signs of temple structures, central administration. Very difficult to gather. Many of these places, when I read about them, were described as microscopically clean. You can't find anything in them at all. But in other places, there's people buried under the floor. There's modelled bulls' heads in the walls. In some of these houses, there's quite a lot of artwork, whereas in others, there's none. So there appears to have been a distinction between visionary and non-visionary, maybe. But we have no context in which these people existed. Can I finish my line of thought? We have no context. There is now another site close by, I gather, being excavated. But to have a society that big, building these amazing houses, and though their walls were close to each other, they didn't touch, having these similar structures and all of that, there must have been other people around. There must have been trading. And that takes me back to one of my favourite sites, which I discovered when I was looking into my history talk, which is a place called Dolní Věstonice, which I think is on the border of Austria and what is now the Czech Republic. And it is basically characterised by some massive stone blocks which mark out buildings, and a whole load of mammoth bones which have apparently been used to make buildings. Now, these people were completely contrary to the guys at Çatalhöyük in that they just never seemed to pick anything up that they dropped. And what there is in this sort of acre of site are tens of thousands of bits of broken pottery. An amazing place. And the thing is that all the pottery is broken and nobody can really work out why that is. They've got some of the best loess on earth, which is it's the kind of clay that goes to make up the stuff that you make these ceramics out of. It's got hardly any oxygen bubbles in it, which means that it's not likely naturally to explode in a furnace. And yet there's thousands of things, human figures, animal figures, all scattered around this place. And once again, I mean, I don't know, I think there was a population of 150 or 200, and several buildings that were built out of, they reckon, animal skins and mammoth bones. Once again, we have no idea who these people were, but the important thing about them is that they were spanning the kind of date when they would have been entering their age of Aquarius. And it coincides with the UK and the fact that I think the oldest skeleton that's been found was found on the Gough Peninsula. And in the light of Lloyd Pye's work, I don't think we can be sure whether it was Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal or just exactly what it was. But it was basically a headless skeleton surrounded in periwinkle shells. So it had obviously been put there. And that is more or less contemporary with the people that were at Dolny Vestonica. Once again, that happened when we were travelling into the age of Aquarius last time round. And the only point I'd like to make about that is obviously all of those sites, each one of them takes us a very, very long way away from Sumer indeed, which is put down as the seat of, so the cradle of civilization. A lot of stuff seems to have happened in Anatolia first.
Lucy, can you wait a second?
The question was, what was the vibration that started cities?
Because what you just said, I mean, you know, Göbekli Tepe or that Çatalhöyük, they're not cities.
No, there's
a very distinct difference.
Well, I know there's no.
When the Bronze Age kicks in,
yeah.
What is the vibration? What is the frequency? What is the thing that actually triggers the cities off? That's
somebody
what's fascinating.
Somebody walked into Sumer and started building cities. The people that walked into Sumer were speaking a language which is generally acknowledged to be unrelated to any other language spoken on Earth. I've no idea where those people came from, but I'm sure that whatever happened in Sumer was a breaking away from whatever had gone before.
David, you're shaking your head.
Right. I want to make 2 quick points. The first is the Sumerian language is not the builders of Sumer. That came later. Okay, there's a pre-Sumerian language. The names of the rivers are named pre-Sumerian names. Buranum, Hiddekel are not Sumerian words. Okay, so there's a civilization there prior to that. Göbekli Tepe is not a settlement. Okay, it's a gathering place. Okay, annually or biannually, whatever it is. Whereas Çatalhöyük is a settlement, and it's not a temple site. Okay, so there are very distinct differences between those two things. What fascinates me about Göbekli Tepe, and I've been to both Çatalhöyük and Göbekli Tepe, is the technology aspect of it. Because human beings we can see going back as far as you want to go. What we don't see is the technology suddenly appearing that we see at Göbekli Tepe. The method of carving those blocks before the Copper Age, before any chisels or any sorts of materials that could have carved those fine lines, those fine sculptures. The astronomical alignments you find that's never mentioned in the archaeological reports. There's a whole plateau there of alignments, holes cut into the rock for posts to stand in, things like that. And and the dating issue is a bit of a mystery. Although it seems to be accurate, how do you date stone? You can't. What they've dated is the soil, not the stones. And the age of soil is a very different thing to the age of the construction of the site. Okay, so there's an argument about that. But the mystery for all archaeologists is the Sumerian or pre-Sumerian civilization, and the first cities that come in the Ubaid period are around 5000 BC at the earliest. And Göbekli Tepe takes us back another 5,000 years. And what's important is the gap between those two. There is no development at all.
So why? How? Why?
Well, nobody's got the answer for that. Nobody's got the answer for that. So I can't answer that question. But what I can also say, I want you all to accept now and never ever swear on your hearts that you'll never ever call those Mesoamerican platform temples pyramids anymore, because they are not pyramids. They are platform temples. They are man-made mountains, and they are identical to what you see, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. They have no connection to Egypt. They have a house of the god on the top. They have staircases going up them. You will not find a pyramid that looks anything like that anywhere. So the closest model, if you want to find a diffusion of this architecture from the old world to the new, you look to Mesopotamia and to Phoenicia. for those. Those were the seafaring nations, not the Egyptians. The Egyptians were so scared of the water, they actually used Byblos ships with Byblos crews. Phoenicians, they couldn't sail on the sea. They were useless on the sea, the Egyptians. So ziggurats are tower temples, and the house of the god rests on the top of the temple, and that is the artificial mountain. If you live in a plain of Sumer, the ancient Mesopotamian plain, it tells you where these people came from, because their gods are mountain gods, and they build artificial mountains to put the house of the god on top. So whoever arrived in the Mesopotamian plain and built those first cities came from the mountains, and the mountains are the Zagros Mountains. And if you go beyond the Zagros Mountains, you get to Göbekli Tepe. You get to all these sites in the hills of Anatolia and western Iran, basically. Sorry.
The archaeological evidence is absolutely amazing, but referring back to my very brief introduction on the first evening to the Vedic tradition, the original question was, of course, about the civilizers. You know, where do the civilizers come from? Well, the Vedic tradition sums it up very neatly. It's all down to the 14 sons of Manu, the avatars, who appear from time to time when the next step is needed. Now, the Vedic tradition, I mean, you're going to have to be ready for this number. The Vedic tradition says that the 14 sons of Manu, between them, exist for over 302 million years. So with the Vedic tradition suddenly puts everything into an entirely different context. It's obviously very conceptual, and quite clearly, if one of those sons of Manu, if a civilizer appears, then something physical has to be done. And that's how the archaeological evidence arises. But the ideas, the knowledge, you know, the ancient wisdom, the eternal knowledge, exists all the time. We've been talking about time, and unfortunately most of our concept of time is linear. Now, if you're embarked upon a course of linear time, there's either sort of forwards, backwards, or if we're lucky, there's now. But again, the ancient eternal view of time is as a cycle. Now, there's something magical about viewing time in a circle. At any point on a circle, you can wake up and connect with the center of that circle, and in that connection, you've tuned in to eternal knowledge. So at any time, when there is a need, sufficient need, there can be a civilizer. There's access to that knowledge at any time. I mean, something that hasn't been spoken about on, you know, during this weekend, of course, are the views of the, I think we have to call them indigenous Australians now. But the views of the indigenous Australians about the dream time, most people looking in from the outside onto that, of course, think it relates to the past. But to those who truly believe the dream time, it's the past, present, and future all rolled into one. Now, from that sort of knowledge, at any time, a new civilizer can emerge.
I'm going to be a bit fussy here and say that we've just a few minutes left, and we've got time for one more question.
Just a quick question, and it might help in wrapping things up. I don't know. Quick point back to light and sound was that in the Hopi creation myth, there's the creator, Spider Woman. She creates two twins. One goes around humming the sound of creation. The other goes around placing her hands on that isn't firm to make it firm. I saw that as light and sound. Anyway, in all of this research that we do, I think one of the things that's apparent to everyone seeking, ancient or eternal knowledge is that we're resource limited, and we're all kind of deciphering as we go. And David, I was hearing at one point in time something about an Egyptian concept of intuition. I think the Greeks called it metanoia or something like that. I'm not positive on that, but I was wondering if you all, in general, had, could talk about how
it was thought of in Greek theology, or Egyptian theology, or in your own mind. How much? How do you use intuition, especially with discernment and clarity, and how does it affect research? I mean, scholarly or esoterically?
I think that's something that a philosopher has to answer, not a practical archaeologist. And I'm sure there are plenty of philosophers here who could answer better than I could. I don't know of any texts where there is even a word in Egyptian for intuition. The concept, I'm not entirely sure what the concept would be. Everything is about working in the environment and landscape in which they operated and evolved, and so everything is born out of that experience. Okay, and the bringing of knowledge is the only extra thing that comes in to the indigenous Nile Valley, which is what I talked about in the last lecture, where there's a spark that comes in. We have this sudden change in Egyptian culture from Naqada 1 to Naqada 2, and then in Naqada 3 we have another giant leap again, and the influences all seem to be from the east, from Mesopotamia. So the bringing of knowledge is the thing that so many people have talked about here. The Hermetica, Thoth's ideas and writing and the word and all those things coming into Egypt, architecture. They're a sudden thing. They're a spark. It's just like that, and it happens. There's no slow development. Writing doesn't evolve like it does in Sumeria slowly. It just happens. Bang, and it's there. Mud brick architecture, bang, it's there. All of a sudden. And that's why I'm a diffusionist by heart and not an independent invention follower, because these things cannot be invented independently. It's around the same time. Everything comes from Sumer, and in a sense, to me, everything comes from Mesopotamia when it comes to Mesoamerica as well. When it happened in Mesoamerica is a different matter. And we have shipwrecks, Phoenician shipwrecks off the coast of Brazil with Carthaginian amphorin. We have terracotta heads in Mexico with Phrygian hats. We have Roman bricks along the coast of Venezuela. Okay, so maybe we are talking pre-Inca, maybe we're not talking very much earlier. Okay, so there are different periods of time when these influences could take place. The Egyptian experience was much, much earlier. The Mesoamerican one was much, much later. But they all come from those people, the bees of the ancient world, who were the Phoenicians, who travelled around the world trading with their ships. And they brought knowledge all over. They are the bees, the pollinators of civilization in the Bronze Age. And we talked about the Bronze Age. Now, we're talking about the transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age, or Copper Age, or whatever you want to call it. That's a different mechanism. But just remember something. If you go into a Lebanese school today and you sit in on a history class, junior history class, the teacher will teach those children that the Phoenicians who live in Lebanon today came from Dilmun, the island of Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf. That was their origins. So, in fact, the Phoenicians themselves came from ancient Sumer, from Mesopotamia. Okay, how did they get there? The mechanism, I think, is they went around the Arabian Gulf. They first arrived in Egypt and they sailed up the coast to Byblos, and that's why Byblos had such an important relationship with Egypt, because they were in fact the same kin. Okay, so they are the pollinators of civilization as far as I can see.
In terms of ancient concepts for intuition, not an expert on pre-Greek languages, but I expect that universally you'll find the notion of a seer, or of seeing, or indeed of hearing. So to be looking in that direction. In terms of Greek philosophy, it was standard to distinguish between rational thought, the sort of discursive thought where you go from A to B to C and therefore D, but there was also a concept of direct knowledge, episteme, where you just knew something. In academic terms, mathematics was an example of that. It's like you don't need to prove that the line is the shortest distance between 2 points. It's just immediately evident. But they also thought that applied to moral issues and also to spiritual issues. Metanoia actually is the Greek word for it's normally translated as repentance in your Bible, but it doesn't actually have that sense of repent. It means a change of mind. So John the Baptist was helping people attain a new level of consciousness, of metanoia, through what baptism really was. Episteme is one. Gnosis would be the other one, meaning revelatory knowledge. In terms of intuition in research, I'd like to give a personal answer to that, which is, I'm not an academic, so I'm not confined by having to explain everything scientifically. but all researchers probably know that if you work with say an idea or a symbol and you follow it, mysterious and miraculous clues happen, adventitious events, and all I can conclude is that if you make a passionate relationship with a concept or symbol, life has a way of bringing synchronicities that help you on your research. That how that happens is very mysterious, but it's important not to make that the be all and end all, because there are various tools in research, from common sense, logic, intuition, guesswork, mistakes as well, and feedback. And often when we get it wrong as researchers, it's because we privilege one of those things over another. If you only follow your intuition, you will get it wrong. If you only follow logic, you will get it wrong. So you have to use these different tools, trusting intuition to move you forward, and then cross-checking. And that's where the science comes in so handy. And you hope that if you use all these different tools, then something meaningful will come out in the end. That's how it works for me anyway.
Well, on that remarkable moment, I think we're going to have to finish. I was just thinking that one of the wonderful things that we all have through all these periods of time is creativity. And, creativity is this fabulous admixture of a kind of a logical reasoning process and these leaps, these extraordinary gifts, wherever they come from. And it's that combination and synthesis which causes sometimes these wonderful abrupt changes that David was referring to earlier on, and they're very exciting and they're unpredictable. That's the wonderful thing. You never know when, where and how the next one's going to happen. But they tend to happen when bodies of people with like minds and open-mindedness come together. That's where the synthesis can start for new ideas, new bases, new parameters for society and everything that we dearly believe in. We've had 2 extraordinary days hearing a wonderful range of material, eternal knowledge in every direction, absolutely wonderful. You've never been given any opportunity to ask any questions. You've probably forgotten what some of the talks were about, but this is your opportunity to bring up those kind of ideas. So we're looking to you right now.
Anybody want to ask any questions? Sorry, if you can just wait for the microphone to get to you.
The lady over there.
Does anybody know anything about Saturn worship?
Does anybody know about Saturn worship? Right, okay, I'm going to have to... It's gone...
Well, yeah, we can, it's not relating to what I was talking about, but do you know about anything about Gough? Gough? George Ivan... Yeah? Gough was a Russian mystic in the 20th century who wrote an extraordinary trilogy of books called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. and in those he talks that the inhabitants of Saturn are the crows, and there was a whole. So your question was about Saturn and Saturn worship. Saturn worship, I don't know, but he said that they were the guardians of one order of wisdom which was brought to planet Earth via the crows. That's the only part I can say to remember. So that's by George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. It is the most incomprehensible book if you get going on it.
Right, okay, thanks.
I'm a bit concerned about this Saturn worship because Saturn is Chronos and Chronos is time, and
it might be worth adding for those who don't know the derivation of the word Kabbalah that it comes from the Hebrew root meaning to receive, and whilst that we can see that reception as meaning receiving texts from the past or receiving knowledge in a more dead way, it really means the receptivity you get from listening, and in the first instance that's the oral tradition, listening to what a teacher or a guru passes on, but ultimately the reception is what Whaymund started us with on the very first lecture, which is listening to the knowledge which is eternal and here and ever present, if we can just be quiet enough to hear it. So that is the concisest understanding of Kabbalah you could have. Just listen.
Question to ask of David Rohl. When you arrived, you seemed somewhat quizzical. Quizzical? Yeah, somewhat puzzled. Are you still puzzled? Has this weekend made any sense to you at all?
I'm more bewildered than puzzled, I think. No,
still,
I'm a bit out of my depth with this material.
I know why.
I'm a very practical Egyptologist. I look at evidence, and evidence takes me wherever it takes me, and it's my religion. I don't believe in something; I have to see it for myself, and that's the sort of pursuit that I go with my archaeology and the evidence I look at. I do make comparisons between cultures and all those things, and I'm here to learn just like everybody else. And I've learnt an awful lot this weekend, and I've really enjoyed myself, apart from the ruddy weather. And the sun comes out just as I'm doing my talk, and nobody can see the slides. Yeah, exactly. I missed the key line I was going to say right at the end of the talk, which was that the age of Sep Tepi the first time was the age of the flood and destruction. And just as I started my lecture, out comes the sun and the age of Ra and the pyramids. So it was a bit of a fate, I think.
Any other questions?
The gentleman over there. Just wait till you get the mic, please.
Yeah. Oh, okay. How do you do? This is wonderful. An absolutely wonderful event. Totally amazing. But there's two things, that occur as basically natural effects: superconductance and levitating superconductors.
Sorry, you have to speak up a little bit.
Oh, superconductors and levitating. There's two natural things that fit, particularly with the beehive aspect, and then something that Harry Oldfield and I were talking about. It has to do with the blink rate. All matter blinks in and blinks out, and when it blinks out, it's in the gap, and in that gap is infinite potential, which you can tap into in however manner, which is the ultimate. There's not 5 dimensions, 2 dimensions. You go backwards. The honeycomb is 2 dimensions. The honeycomb is 2 dimensions. Okay, sorry. All right, so do you understand superconductance that works off the honeycomb, and also Grabinnikov's cavity structure effect, where you had a flying platform that came in harmony with the ethers? because it came in harmony with the ethers, it was able to levitate and travel like 900 miles an hour, things like that?
Well, my answer is I probably don't. But there may be people here who do. When I think of the gap, I just think of Mind the Gap and the shop, a bit primitive. So superconductance and the space, the blink.
I know where Mike's coming from, and I've had some conversations with Mike to do with this blink rate, but I suppose the nearest I would get is where the vortex flows out.
It's just a personal note. I don't know much about words like Kabbalah or ancient wisdom. I just want to think, I think there is a kind of wisdom that is there out there, and it's the wisdom where time no exist, and we have like lost the connection to that, and it's like a shaman. He don't learn like in books. This plant is good for that, or this plant is good for that, from generation to generation. No. The shaman would learn to his children how to get that information, but he would not learn that in books. And we have to learn how to get that information. That can be by intuition, by all those capabilities that we have to rediscover. But they are within us. All that know-how is there. And yeah, that was just a personal note I wanted to tell.
I never set out to study bees. I went to Spain to study with a Kabbalist who taught Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau, and we were going to study the Rennes-le-Chateau parchments. She was going to reveal the mysteries of those parchments via the Kabbalah, because she believed the mystery requires the knowledge of the Kabbalah to understand. And over breakfast, we had a bee like the size of my fist fly around the breakfast table. And we got to talking about bees, and we spent 3 years decomposing the history of bee veneration using the Kabbalah. And so that's kind of how I stumbled upon it, and a lot of the things I've discovered have been discovered in the process of looking at history using the Kabbalah as a context.
The whole of our culture worships a thing called the dead line, whereas I think we ought to be worshipping the lifeline. Next question, please. Sorry.
Yes, if I can follow up this worship of Chronos and time. In my little introductory talk, I talked about the fact that we're now in the Kali Yuga, and I gave you some fairly sort of mind-blowing years. But the Kali Yuga, you probably remember, is the shortest of all. Well, just as much life and experience is packed into that shortened Yuga as exists in all the others. So one of the real identifiers that we're deep already into the Kali Yuga is this obsession with time, that we all believe there just isn't enough time. So welcome to the Kali Yuga.
And I'm obsessed with time as well. I keep taking time away with my work.
Is the Kabbalah linked to any of the knowledge we've learned about this weekend?
Right, is the Kabbalah related to any of the knowledge? Well, who's going to start on that?
Very much so. I mean, I spoke in my talk about some of the early 17th century Rosicrucians and Freemasons, and their view of the eternal knowledge or ancient wisdom was utterly grounded in the Kabbalah. Sometimes more in a Christianized Kabbalah, sometimes more in a Judaic Kabbalah. But I think the combination of the wisdom from Kabbalah with the Hermetic texts was very much the way that the wisdom passed into our modern world. So I would say it's not just related, it was central to how it's come to us. It's changing, obviously. We have access to a wider range of information, but personally, I think the Kabbalah is one of the most elegant and comprehensive expressions of the ancient wisdom.